Hey guys, and welcome to the show, The Search For. If you are not aware, most of the world has been buried in some kind of worldwide mud flood catastrophe. You've probably never heard of this before, just as I haven't. Going through college, taking many science courses, archaeology, anthropology, sociology, no one ever mentioned in classes mud flood, an event that has buried most of the old world cities, if not entire cities, 40 feet, 20 feet, 15 feet underground. Just as you are looking at in this picture right here, you see this town here, this entire city, and you see even in this old world picture sometime in the early 1900s, late 1800s, it is being dug out, and you can see that this city has been buried in mud, if not in recent times during that period or ancient times, and they're trying to dig it out. You see in the right-hand corner over here an old world-looking building and just the frame of it left. And you see to the left here this building, and they've put some kind of blockade around it. I don't know why that fence is there. Perhaps it was to try to stop more mud from building up. But this is very curious as you see the town digging things out in old world buildings over to the side. In this picture here, you see where they have dug out from what is the surface now, probably 20 some feet. Below the surface was the actual old world level of the earth, and here are statues buried underground, fully intact, and some kind of cataclysmic event took place and just buried it all. We've never heard about this in history. No one ever taught us this, and don't think they haven't been digging out things long before we were born, and they know this. This is a hidden fact from us. We are just given some kind of odd narrative about things as if sediment just built up over time, but 40, 100 feet of sediment completely burying these structures, even filling the insides of the buildings up with mud, does not answer the narrative to someone with any minor amount of intelligence. So here, if you want to get a very good example of this, is the capital of the United States in Washington, D.C. Now, people will say, oh, well, you know, this is a very complicated building. It's the White House, and they built basement structures for different things. But we're talking about the idea that this building was built in either the 1700s, and they said it was burnt down. They always say stuff was burnt down. And rebuilt or reconstructed in the 1800s after the war with the British, the 1800s war. What we're looking at here is we have a country that was in constant conflict, financially struggling and trying to get itself on its feet, do trade, commerce. And here you're looking at, at least 100 feet of basement, and possibly what we're looking at is the old part of the entranceway, perhaps underneath with these columns. And who in the 1700s, with the technology they said they had of shovels and wheelbarrows and wagons. Who at this time could have dug out the basement and the levels to go down 100 feet into the, and who knows if it goes farther than this, we don't know. Who dug this out with shovels for the foundation this long ago? This is the narrative that makes us think this building actually went down farther. And those steps you see in the front is a later added on facade. Hard to say, but in the White House there are buried windows around the sides of the building and stuff where no one, we know, builds a structure and then buries the windows to the basement halfway in dirt. All right, moving along. So here again, in this instance, we're talking about the mud flood. We're looking at a street that was dug out for a particular reason. A lot of times they're putting sewer pipes down, or they need to get to certain parts of one building to fix something, and then they discover that the buildings are actually much older and there's many floors to it because, as you see here at the top left, no one builds a window or an entrance to bury it in dirt. People try to say it's the basement. No one builds column-like looking structures to a basement. So we can see here that this is part of a cover-up of some sort. And now people walk along the streets about 20 or 30 feet above the old street level, if this, in fact, is the street level that's been dug up. It could go 2 more floors down. So, here is the White House again some years ago as it is being reconstructed and some renovations done. If you look to the left, look at this red line here that's going across the screen, and you will see what is considered or was considered the ground level entrance as you went up to the steps. And as you can see here to the left, the windows to what should be called the basement, let's say, is buried underground. No one builds a building and creates fancy windows and then buries it in dirt on purpose. This building, and sometime during the United States history that no one has told us about, something occurred and buried this building in a mud flood. Now, what we're looking at here is not mud flood, but we're looking at old world structures that they say were built as a temporary entertainment for the public. Another historical narrative where we find the story now becoming what we call borderline self-retarded in believing anymore. You have Chicago in 1893 telling you this is a World's Fair and stuff was built out of plaster of Paris and it's just temporary. The problem is some of the buildings to these things were left and they're still standing today. Let's say they leave an art building or some kind of museum and you go look at it and you're like, this building is very well built. It's not made of plaster of Paris. You know, it wouldn't have lasted 100 years until now. So what we're looking at, part of the cover-up when we have mud flood, is also the fact that these buildings and these grand structures existed in the United States from San Francisco to St. Louis to Buffalo to Chicago. These grand, beautiful, and miraculous structures, unlike what we have now in the United States, which is an architecture style called brutalism, meant to offend your psyche, meant to lower down your educational thinking or your aesthetics for beauty, and to destroy your will to proceed or move beyond what the controllers are holding you at. And yes, brutalism is a type of architecture with a psychological manipulation behind it. That's why the Soviets used the communists in Soviet Russia and around the world use brutalism architecture to construct things to basically get people to live like termites. All right, so here is another picture of the White House. This one's a little blurry, but again, you can see these structures. Here's would be the level, which would be considered a ground level, and you can see dirt. Everything is just, it's been buried, and they say nothing about it. There's no explanation. And here is an image from a structure in Old World that was buried. You see these men with shovels trying to dig it out. You see in the center here another, it looks like a chimney, but it's actually some kind of column or something, of brick. And everything is just buried. And look how many feet of dirt that is there. This guy's 6 foot tall, and he's standing way down here, 6, 12, 24, 32, 48. 50 feet of mud burying the old world buildings. It's crazy, right? All right, so here we have an example of what's called possibly melted buildings. Now, when it comes to Jordan, Petra, and things like this, I'm wondering, and I can't prove this as I haven't stood in front of them to study it, but they only show us a little short section of Jordan or of Petra. And Petra is a gigantic place. It was an entire city. And this city, as you look at it, is melted. The buildings, the structures are melted, and I am wondering if these areas that look like they were carved out of stone, which seems like a retarded, magnificent feat, but why would somebody just carve this? But if something was buried in mud, it looks a whole lot more simple that someone partially dug out the parts of the buildings that were there. They dug them out and exposed the entranceways. So, we know in places like India, we have entire temples that were carved out of single portions of rock. But is it possible that that temple was buried and they dug out the mud and then it hardened into rock? I don't know. I can't explain it. But I do know that in Jordan and Petra, if you take a good look around this, you could do an entire series on this, of all of the structures around there. They are melted buildings. So from Saudi Arabia to Iran and India, and especially this picture in Egypt, especially this picture to the bottom left in India, you can see an entranceway to a temple or an old building, and everything above it looks like it was melted or buried in mud and turned to rock. I believe you are looking at, in this world, from mud flood to the melted buildings, either a wrath of God or some kind of weaponry that melted buildings and created liquefaction of the soil. We're talking about weapons beyond nuclear in ancient times that just destroyed cities. And as we read in the Bible, it talks about Armageddon and the buildings being melted like molten glass, or melting like in the mountains, and things melting like wax. And when we find these old buildings all around the world, if there was a judgment and Armageddon took place already, according to the Bible, if it took place already, and it's not like these pastors who have been selling us the story that it's coming and Jesus is coming on the clouds now instead of it already of happening, then we can look, and the Bible telling us about an event, we can see a worldwide cataclysm of melted buildings. This is almost undeniable now. So here is another example of, us traveling around in the modern times with a paved road and having no idea we're driving over top of some ancient structure where people in the old days were walking around and their level ground was 40, 100 foot down from where it is now. What did this to the world we live in? What buried our entire world was the flood of Noah not so long ago. Was it a worldwide weapon? It had to be some kind of cataclysm. And then people repopulated the earth ignorant of what had happened in the past. They just don't know. Erased from their memory. I don't have an explanation for it. Perhaps you do. As we take a look at this image here, I'm hoping that you can see that this is one of the best examples of a melted ancient structure. Because no one can build this or build a structure like this into the rocks and cause the rocks to melt like wax above them. And a lot of times you'll see things like doorways where the rock or the structure is kind of molded into it, and it's kind of, instead of being a square shape, it's like blobular because the stone melted. Here we have, this looks like St. Petersburg, and these people are digging out, and in fact, this looks like a stone structure with many rocks and things. If you take a look around, what has happened to this place? Look how deep it goes. What buried this place? Who brought in these stones, if they were brought in, to stack them up? It wasn't people with wagons. This is a very bizarre photo indeed. I cannot explain it, but it doesn't match anything that our history books have told us about. Here we have more examples of ancient destroyed cities, partially buried in dirt and partially melted. You can see that this structure, which looks like a pyramid, and you're looking inside of it, it looks like rooms, and it almost looks like some place you would live instead of the ancient style of pyramid we have looked at in the past. But what devastated this thing and caused this to happen? No way of explaining. This is another angle of St. Petersburg, I believe, and you can try to focus in and see what's going on. It's very unusual what is happening here with the rocks and see the horses and what's actually going on. I can't explain what's happening here. It sure doesn't look natural. And if you look off to the left, Up at the top to the left here, you see a building that doesn't look like it's being constructed, but looks like it was destroyed and partially falling apart. This does not look like a construction site. It looks like a devastation site. I don't find any recordings in the history books that explains this. Here is another image, and as you can see here, the building, what looks like the foundation blocks, you can see the street level, and then you can see this old-timey truck here and a guy with a shovel, and they are trying to dig out this building. We have seen floods. We have seen what can happen with earthquakes and stuff. Never have we seen an earthquake or a flood do this to a city. The problem is this is worldwide, as if it happened all at one time. So here is this guy down here, and these two men digging out this gigantic mass of mud. And we definitely have the ability in many books and history from the time when people were driving these trucks around. And yet, we don't have a single book that I have heard of today of anyone, not a newspaper or a book, telling us that the world was flooded in a cataclysm that killed off most of the world population, flooded all the crops, and buried the cities. And yet, here is an image of this man digging it out. Massive subterranean structure. Not a peep, not an explanation to tell us what happened. Now, here we can have a very good example. Unless our ancestors were termites, these buildings and these structures, the windows, you can see, especially the one in Peru, it looks like these buildings were a giant candle, and just somebody lit it on fire and melted them, and then it hardened into rock in some portions, and in other portions it remained the building, but all of the windows and the doors and the structures are all bent and twisted and no longer linear. We have this in the Midwest in the United States. This is found, and they try to tell us that they were dug out by, just primitive Indians that lived and dwelled in those structures, and whatever crap is the technical term I would call it for explaining these buildings. So from Georgia to Bulgaria, Peru, United States, and in China, melted buildings. Here is some excavation going on from different places. We've seen some of these pictures before, but just take a look at where the road level is, and then underneath you can see that the buildings and the inhabitants used to walk on streets and used to live and enter into these buildings way farther down. Life on our planet has been buried. So when we're looking for tools and structures and machinery and technology, most of it somehow has been buried, and that's why we can't find it. Our history is underground, and if we want to find it, we need to start digging. So here you can see also, which they even in St. Louis and different places in America, New Orleans, underground. They actually have these, they call it the underground cities and stuff like that. But here you can see that the street level. Here's the doors. You walk into these shops or houses or whatever. But in reality, look where the window is and the old doorway to these buildings. We walk along the streets thinking this is normal and this is how this building was built, and it was always this level, only to find out that the world has been buried. Here is an old city, and once again, no one builds these buildings like this, these structures, and then decides to dig out the streets. Do you see what's going on here? Here is a cataclysmic event, much greater than just a flood occurring. And this is in a modern enough time where someone could have put in a newspaper or recorded this event taking place, and yet not a word can we find of something devastating this place to this extent. I want some answers. How about you? Wouldn't you like to know what's going on? If they're covering up this event for whatever reason, they're lying to us about history because just simply by omission. There is no way that this took place. I mean, we hear all kinds of stories in the United States about the Indians and what this guy did and that guy did, but we don't hear about this event. This event would have killed millions of people. And lots of people would have starved because it would have buried all the crops. Yet we hear nothing. Here is a very good example, as you can see here, of what a temple looks like that wasn't destroyed. And then on the left, you can see that somehow another temple was hit with some kind of weapon, and you can see within the structure of it, as you can look closely, where columns were and structures to the temple or building were, and yet it was turned to stone. I call it the Medusa weapon. Something launched a weapon. Someone, something launched a weapon against the ancient world. Here we have a city. This is how you discover most of the underground things here, but they're digging out the old level of the streets, perhaps. Digging it out for whatever reason, trying to undo what's happened. And this could be early 1900s. You can see the men walking around dressed there. What happened, and why didn't they tell us about it? How could they consider this not to be important? Isn't this cool? Take a look at this now. As you can see in the top corner here is an example of the upper portions of an undamaged temple. And below they try to tell us, and of course, now it's so offensive to take a look at these structures like this when you have had scientists and archaeologists, geologists tell you that this particular thing you're looking at here was caused by some kind of scientific earth reaction, the flowing of water from some kind of geological event, or the buildup of some kind of sedimentary specialized rock because of the rotation of the sun and the moon, and whatever they can dream up in some ridiculous scientific fantasy and their theological scientism religion. It's ridiculous. I don't want to hear it anymore. It's offensive to anyone with any kind of brain who can think. Now, in the past, they would have fooled me because I was trusting the science. But I know now that what I'm looking at is a melted temple. Here is a simple example of a buried bridge. You can see drainage down there from some point in time. A big question to ask is who made all of these, trillions of bricks that built the ancient world, it's way beyond billions. The making of bricks from the old world is just, the red bricks, astounding. Why we don't find more of these brick factories from back in the day, perhaps they were all buried, I don't know. Here again is a melted structure. They tried to tell you that this was a kind of, like, they found little caves, so what they did is they went and built a structure, or built entranceways out of stone or some kind of structure, or carved things away and made an entrance to caves or whatever. But if you take a really good close look at this and examine it with any kind of common sense, the stone blends in with the entrance ways, and what you're really looking at is a disfigured and melted structure. I can guarantee you, if you got up to this really close and examined what's going on, you will see the melted and unmelted portions morphing into each other. This is an example of the liquefaction, or the melting of the buildings like wax. Here is a great example of an ancient buried temple. And as you can see, at some point in time, this entire city was buried, where most of the buildings that people go in and hang out in and visit, most of that building is really like an iceberg. It's the majority of the building is buried underground in many, many feet of dirt. And here you can see in the city they're excavating these temples. I assume this is in India. How in India, and we see buildings in the United States and buildings in China and buildings in Japan. How has the world been buried without any explanation or writing of it? I tell you, it's as if these people during that time were wiped out, like a Book of Revelation apocalypse, and a few people, a remnant, was left and then set back on the earth, completely ignorant of what happened, or in a couple of generations they gave them a new history book, and voila, here we are today, still living under a lie of the controllers. Okay, and this is great too. As you take a look at this, first of all, how did someone climb this structure and build these things, and what would be the point of doing this? It sure would make a whole lot more sense if this was one huge structure at one time. As you can see, it looks like someone poured mud over top of it, and a few parts were left sticking out or dug away, especially in this area as you see this mud build up around it, as if someone wouldn't just carve that away. I believe what we're looking at here is either a gigantic mud flood section on this, or a melted building. But these structures that are sticking out weren't just built like this. Here is, I believe this is in Georgia, I could be wrong, but you can see where the street level is, and then you can see that there's buildings, or the rest of buildings going, and you see this ladder going down here. Those buildings, or this structure, goes way, way down there. What buried our world? Now this is a very cool picture here. As you can see, men in wagon times, probably early 1900s. You can see that this city was buried in dirt. There's some temporary structures here built later, and these people are trying to dig out what was happening. Just another cool picture from back in the day. Nobody mentions a word about the mud flood. This is a very famous picture, probably one of the best examples of the old world getting buried and then a new city built on top of it, a less sophisticated city. And you know, as you take a look at this, you're like, whoa, this whole thing, they're sitting on top of pillars. Kind of weird. You'd think it would collapse. And how far down does it go even below this? How many stories more is this building underground? What buried this? I mean, think about it. Here's a bulldozer in the bottom left-hand corner. And let's say that thing's 15 feet, 20 feet tall by the time you get to the top of it. And then the mud goes up above that, so that's probably 30 feet. And then you have, you know, a carved out section here. I don't know if that was an old street level or does it go down more. I assume by the fact that in this portion here it looks like a thickened concrete there for the old road. I don't know, it's bizarre, but this is one of the most famous pictures explaining the old world got buried. Where's the history? So this is just an old drawing, if it's real or not, showing cataclysm taking place. Basically like going from the old world getting destroyed, lightning and fire, and in the new world, these simple structures to the right. I don't know. Another picture of Washington, D.C. and them doing some reconstruction on it. Much of what you see in old pictures of them explaining, trying to say, oh, we were building this building XYZ, they're really just renovating it from structural damage or things that took place. The buildings were much, much older. Here's a good example of melted buildings. Do you believe that someone's going to, you know, carve their windows like this, you know, in this structure? As you look at it, this was melted and it just, I don't know, ended up blobbing. Like you have the top portions up here. It's weird. It's like the top portion melted like wax onto it and then hardened. This says that it's the 2nd Street between Delaware and Main Street in 1869. You see the Mechanics Bank building on the left. So if this isn't one of the super duper explanations, take a look at this building here, this bank building, and then look at the dirt and the mud that flooded this thing. That, and then off in the distance you can see the same thing. That's a lot of dirt. And why didn't anything get recorded of this catastrophe? Why would they hide it? And was that building really built in 1869 like they say? This is a famous picture. You see this quite a lot in the mud flood. But here's the street level. As you can see, you see windows. And then you see the old ground level way, way down here. I'm not sure when this took place. But you see the old world buildings and some kind of imagery of a cataclysm, perhaps water. Like I say, I don't know if this photo is real or a representation, but you can see it's representing something flooding this entire area. So some of these we have seen in the imageries, but you can take a look from Russia. The buried buildings, you find it in America. Even, I believe this is Chicago, if you look over here to the left. You have a street on top of the old buildings, and then buildings on top of the buildings. Man, they must have built those old structures strong. But you can't get around that. And then you see Europe buried in mud. So, Europe, South Asia buried in mud. All around the world, everything has been buried without a peep of history. Here's another angle so you can see a more realistic view of what happened, of the one we saw from Delaware. Take a look over here to the right, the mud and dirt that hasn't been dug away yet, and then the mud to the left here on the buildings. Incredible. And you can even see in the street, it looks like columns, something like columns from ancient structures or something that's just laid out there. It's almost as if they're digging this city out. Not that something happened to it, but they discovered the city and the buildings that were buried, and they're digging them out for use. And the cover-up story would be that these people built these buildings, but really they found them. See this here? What a great example of more modern-looking buildings, they would say, built in late 1800s, early 1900s, yet no one stacks dirt up above the window line or builds their basement. Look at this. You can see over here in this area to the right that a portion of the building is just, it got mud flooded. Mud poured in there and filled it in. All right, so I believe that's the end of the images. I hope that this short section talking about this will really explain and show to you that the world has been mud flooded and has been melted like wax. Some kind of catastrophe, whether it's a biblical event took place or a geological event, but something happened. No one can explain it or is telling us about it. And so therefore we cannot trust the modern sources of archaeology, of history, sociology, anything dealing with the sciences, even going up through the collegiate level. We're being lied to about this. Okay, guys, this is the end of the show today. If you would like to get into more subject matter like this, share your own thoughts, and learn things that we cannot mention or talk about on these channels because they are censored, and we can get a little more in-depth in things, join our family at the Truth Council. It's a school we have and a discussion group where everyone can share their thoughts and learn a great deal without censorship or trolls. It's on school, and it's called the Truth Council. I'll leave a link below so that you can join. Also, if you would like to get a copy of Reason to Believe, how they have been fooling us and using trickery and different methods of psychological operations and black magic on us for many years. You can get a copy of the book Reason to Believe. A link will be left below. But I encourage you also to join the Truth Council. Right now it is free to join for a limited time. So join the many people who have already gotten into the groups and the discussions. You're going to love it if you love this type of stuff. This is Dan Collier, and I thank you for joining me today for The Search For.